Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to 2 Peter chapter 2. And that'll be the introductory text that we are looking at. And starting in verse 4 of that chapter, we read, "For God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who would afterward live ungodly, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man, dwelling among them, tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations, and to reserve the judgment under punishment for the day of judgment." What I wanted to focus on, I wanted to read the verse in its context, was Lot. And we see in verse 8, it's plainly laid out for us, the challenge that Lot had faced. He lived in the city of Sodom specifically, which was mentioned in verse 6. And Sodom is notorious, of course, for the sin of Sodom. In fact, the name even comes from the city. And he was tormented daily, it says, by the things that he saw and heard from the people that were in that city. And we know from chapter 18 of Genesis that he was pretty much one of the only righteous people in that city. So he was a righteous person that was surrounded mostly by the wicked. And it says that it tormented him. And I want us to look at how we can be tormented as well by unrighteous things around us, and what we can do about it. Now, if we go back to Genesis chapter 13, we recognize that Lot, and it's very important for us to note that what we see: righteous Lot, verse 7, righteous man, verse 8, righteous soul, verse 8 as well. That Lot is described as a righteous person. Nevertheless, Lot, to an extent, contributed to his own torment by his poor decision-making. And what I'm referring to is in chapter 13 of Genesis. I'll summarize the first 11 verses for us. Essentially, is Abraham, and of course, Lot is Abraham's nephew and had lived with him for quite the time. And we know that Abraham was blessed of God, and he had a large amount of flocks, and Lot ended up having a large amount of flocks. So large, in fact, that it ended up that there wasn't really enough space to accommodate both of them. So Lot and Abraham had a conversation, and it was decided, you know what, we're going to have to split up our flocks. We're going to go one way and the other. And Lot says, when it comes to who's going to go where, in verse 11 of chapter 13 of Genesis, it says, "And Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east. They separated from each other. Abraham dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord." We know that Canaan eventually ends up becoming wicked. And in fact, there probably was a fair amount of wickedness even then. Not to the degree, though, that there was when Joshua expelled the Canaanites from the land. We know that because God specifically says to Abraham, the sin of the Amorite is not yet complete. So they would have been probably still involved with things that they shouldn't. But in verse 13, it says, "Were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord, the men of Sodom." And Lot had chosen to go there for economic reasons. So even though he was a righteous individual, he had thrown in with unrighteous. He had made a decision that was good for his wallet, or the equivalent thereof back then, money, purse, coin purse, money belt, or whatever, but was not particularly good for his faith. We unfortunately live in a society that has embraced a degree of wickedness similar to Sodom, beyond Sodom in some regards, and done so with incredible speed. I was born only in the 1970s. I was not born in the 30s, 40s, or 50s. Had I been, I would have seen an even greater amount of change. But even since I was born, same-sex marriage has been legalized. Abortion on demand is almost all over the place. Euthanasia is now a thing, et cetera, et cetera. And who knows how long I'll live to be, how much more will be permitted in our society. And we are bombarded with images and stories of this sort of thing anymore. So unlike Lot, I think there's a certain extent to which we are in a gigantic, if you would, Sodom. And when I'm saying that, I'm not just referencing the particular sin of Sodom. I actually think that even though Sodom is known for that sin after which it's named, we also see it's prosperous and it is rich. And I think that what happened is very similar to what happened that Paul outlines in Romans 1, that they had forgotten God, they had been distracted by wealth, and they engaged themselves in all sorts of sins. That one is just one of, and the one that they're most notorious for of many. Our society is similar to that. We can't get out of unless we decide to move, and guess what? Other parts of the world are just as bad. What do we do? Well, what can't we do? Well, let's look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. He acknowledges this to a certain extent. Now, in the context, he is talking about dealing with immorality in the church. But he makes a point here in that context. In verse 9, he says, I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. So that means even Paul acknowledges in his day there was this problem, right? In where he was, in the Roman world, and for the Corinthians, good luck. You're never going to be able to entirely avoid seeing and hearing about sin around us. And yet, here we have in 2 Peter the situation where Lot and ourselves can sometimes get sort of feeling frustrated, overwhelmed, or depressed even about all the things that we see and hear that do get us down. In fact, the motivation for this story, this sermon, was such a situation, and poor William had to endure a text rant of mine back and forth, and I even honestly forget what it was but I know it was something in the news, and just one of those things where you see or read something and you just shake your head about. I just don't get how people can just, you just shake your head. How can a person just be that so casually wicked? So we have to live in the world. We can't get out of the world. How do we deal with those feelings? How do we get so that we're not overwhelmed by it? Well, let's turn to Philippians, because the solution is, this will take up most of our time for the remainder, is, I would say, aggressively applying Philippians chapter 4, verse 8 is one way. Now, there's multiple ways in which we could approach this. But I want to take the approach of where is our focus? And Philippians 4:8 is a well-known verse. It says, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. I'd like us to consider applications from this verse. The first thing I'd like us to do as a way to help us to not be overwhelmed and tormented. The first thing I think we can benefit from is by looking at the verse in its context. Going back to verse 6 and 7. Oftentimes with some of these verses that are very powerful just by themselves, they can be pulled out of context. The most notorious one for that is down in verse 13, the favorite verse of NFL players. Verse 6 and 7, it says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and thanksgiving. Let your requests be everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ." Then he gets into that, right? So there is anxiety that's being spoken of and peace of heart in connection with, finally, so a conclusion, meditating on those things. And then verse 9 is important as well, which we'll get into too. "The things which you learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do, and the God of peace will be with you." So, and there is that God of peace. If we're looking for another instance where we saw it in Romans, there's another instance right there of it. So meditate on these things. Now, before we unpack is so something about the terminology, because we'll be talking about meditating quite a bit. What's meant by that? Because the world's definition of meditation and the biblical definition of meditation don't always align. So when we hear meditation commonly in the world, we're talking about breathing exercises and clearing your mind and mindfulness, and it's linked to that, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. There can be health benefits to that and mental health benefits to that. But meditation, actually, if you turn to Luke chapter 24 and verse 11, you'll actually find a good, I think, in the context, you'll intuitively know what it is. 24:11? No. Where is it? Oh, 21:14. Sorry. 21:14. There it is. There we go. That's better. This is talking about, so the apostles are going to be, Jesus is saying, they're going to be arrested. They're going to be brought up before, and he's giving them a warning. In chapter 21 and verse 14, he says, "Therefore, settle it in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer." Right? You intuitively get in the context what he's saying. He's saying to the apostles, don't worry about what you're going to say. In this case, the Spirit is going to be, if we look at the parallel in Matthew 24, the Spirit will help you answer. But meditating in that context has to be, you're picturing someone and they're about to go before the king and they're sitting there going, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? They're thinking about it. They're contemplating on it. They're weighing it. They're debating it, right? So when the scriptures say in, for example, Psalm chapter 1, that the righteous meditate on God's law day and night, then we see in the context here about meditating on those things that are pure and noble and just and lovely and a good report. They are weighing it. They are thinking about it. They are analyzing it. They're evaluating it. They're thinking about, how does that apply to me? How does that apply to others? How does that apply to my service to God? It's a very active analysis with application, almost, if you would, that's going on here in this case of meditation. And implicit in that, I think, is that, and in that regard, it does have similarities to what the common or worldly definition of the world would be. I think there is an instance in which it's not rushed. It is taking the time to really make the application and evaluate it, not just, that's inspirational, next chapter, right? Which we can often sometimes tend to do when we check our faith like a checklist of things to do. So applying Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, I think involves three things. Avoiding the negative, embracing the positive, and doing the things that will further this. So first, to avoid the negative, and I want to give a caveat of what I don't mean by this. And avoiding the negative is not necessarily avoiding negative people. There's a lot, and I know, Shelley, you've shown me the posts that are, on Facebook and stuff like that you'll see where it says, avoid all negative people, and I've seen them myself, and a lot of the books that I've read that are sort of, I guess, in the order of self-help. It says, identify those people that suck the joy out of your life and just avoid them entirely, which starts to treat people in a transactional basis of, what can this person do for me? We don't really have that luxury as Christians, even if we wanted to. I think sometimes we have to, maybe, especially if we find ourselves being influenced by negative people, we might have to limit our time or control the circumstances under which we interact. We might have to have conversations with and about, or learn to help. But imagine if Jesus had avoided all negative people. There would have been one disciple, maybe, right? Or maybe perhaps none. If we avoid, how are we going to teach the gospel to people? We have a wide range of people that we have to share the gospel with, and some of them are going to be very pessimistic and negative. Surprise, surprise! When you don't have hope in your life, you're going to be negative. Some of them are going to be, very close to the truth, who just need to be taught the way a little more perfectly. But so in that regard, we do have to sometimes deal with negative things. But what I'm saying, though, is that we need to avoid a constant negative influence in our life that's from the world, is completely avoidable, that doesn't really add any value at all. And what I'm going to talk about, and don't worry, this is not going to be a sermon that rants about the news, though that is part of it. Poor Brian has heard my rant multiple times, but he's captive in the car, so unless he dives out of it while I'm at a stoplight, he's stuck listening to my rant about the news. Should have not told you that you could just run at the stoplight. You're going to do that now. And to prove a point, if you do this, and I know the reason why we love to watch the news is the common thing is always said, I want to be informed about what's going on. I can tell you very quickly that A, it takes a lot less time than you think to know the minor points. And B, I actually have done before where I've deliberately not watched the news for a week to a month, and somehow still knew, like either from other people talking about it. I'm not sure how. I never actively went out looking for a headline, and I still somehow knew what was going on. It should just show you how pervasive and all around it is. Try it yourself sometimes. Go ahead. Don't watch the news for a week, for a month, and then turn it back on. You will notice stuff so quickly that you never noticed before. The first thing I noticed, and this has actually happened, a friend of mine, because I've been trying to make my lunch more often and bring it in as opposed to going out. I brought my lunch, and it's the cafeteria. Unfortunately, the news is on in the cafeteria. And I sat down having lunch at work with a friend. There's the news on in the background. And the one news story is just set in a normal tone. It's not really that interesting. And then all of a sudden, the next one comes on. And I forget what it's about. Let's just say it's about, well, what's the big headline now? The coronavirus or whatever, right? That's one of them. Newscaster's tone changes, speeds up, is almost breathless, and the images that are being shown, flash and go much shorter and quicker. Whereas in the previous one, it maybe stayed on an image for 5 to 10 seconds. In this case, it's almost like an action movie. We're over here, we're over here, we're over here, we're over here. Why are they doing this? Like talking louder, talking faster, talking breathless. Not running. She's sitting at a desk. She out of breath. It's obvious. It's a fear. They're trying to actually get me sitting there watching to have the same level of anxiety that they have. They're actually producing all the same things. Never noticed it before until you don't watch it for a week to a month. It stands out like a sore thumb. Like they're actually trying to get me to be anxious and afraid, right? Do you think that has no effect on us? The more that we are watching a worldview, and there's the problem. For time's sake, I'm going to condense this, what I was going to say about it. When we are engaged in watching something like that on a regular basis, what we are watching is somebody else's view of the world. If you also don't think that's the case, go ahead and then not only not watch something, but watch a station or a news source you typically would never watch before, right? If you typically watch right-wing stuff, right-wing quote, quote, go to The Guardian. If you typically watch like Fox News, go to The Guardian, go to CBC. If you typically watch CBC, go to Fox News. You'll notice the difference night and day, right? You will. Go to Al Jazeera versus BBC, for example. You'll notice the difference. You're watching a worldview. Here's the problem. Worldview in all of those sources, even if some of them do try to do their best, is walking by faith, other way around, walking by faith and not by sight. We want to walk by faith and not by sight. It's fear-based. It's blame-based. It's sectarian-based. It's based on anger and resentment, blaming the victim, finding the victim, simple solutions to complex problems, and always worldly solutions to worldly problems, and never faith-based solutions to worldly problems. And here we can be sitting there just taking this all in day after day after day. Let me ask you a question. Go through this with me. When was the last time you saw a news article that you thought was, well, let's give it true. Let's give it the first one on the list, and let's say that for once there's no agenda, no bias, and no lies. Let's give it true. Okay, we'll give them that one just as a bonus. When was the last time that you watched an entire news program that you would say reflected things that were noble, just, pure, lovely, and a good report, virtuous, and praiseworthy? Nope. Maybe once or twice in the last decade that I could say that. But as the old expression goes, and you've heard me quote it lots of time, even a broken clock gets to be right twice a day. Analog, not digital, obviously. So that's what happens if we have our focus. We can get overwhelmed because we're allowing that negativity to constantly bombard us. And it's even more, and that's for quality. What I would say is quality or professional level journalism. We have social media and the quagmire that is the comment section. We've got low grade journalism who doesn't even try to hide their bias and their agenda. Turn with me, if you would, to Philippians. I'm going to quote it. Evil company corrupts good morals. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15. In this day and age, I think company we can extend for it would have to always be people that we've spent time with in person physically. There was no mass communication that could push things out. I would say that the time that we're spending with individuals, and that includes not just the news, but also with the movies that we watch, the music that we listen to, the books that we read, etc., etc. Paul is explicit in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 15 and 16. No, I wrote this. Where is it? Maybe it's 15. Where did it go? Redeeming the time. Where did that go? With that? Did I mean Colossians and not Philippians? No? Yes. 5. 5, 15, and 16. Okay, I wrote down 4. and 15 and 16. Right, there we go. See that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil, is what's being said there. So how much time we have a limited amount of time. There's no doubt about that. How we choose to spend that time is up to us. But Paul says, but right there blatantly, to be careful with it. We have to buy back the time. We have to buy our opportunities, as another translation puts it. We really want to be spending it with the negative things that can overwhelm us. Unlike relationships might not actually have any benefit, or do we want to go ahead and put it in the positive? Putting it in the positive instead of the negative is focusing on the things that are right here in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 8. Is to meditate on those things. There's a striking resemblance, and we see that Christianity is a very active faith. If we turn to Matthew chapter 7, I quote it, verse 7 in chapter 7, verse 7, seek and ye shall find. The actual tense that the Greek language is, and apparently is not that it's a finished act, and we often treat it like that, right? Oh, I found it. Okay, good. My work's over. Phew, I can just spend the rest of my life doing whatever. It's this active seeking. And we see that in the earlier part of Ephesians chapter 5, verse 10. In the context of the verse we just read, it says, finding out what is acceptable to the Lord. And later on, we see, do not be unwise, but know what the will of the Lord is. So when we make room in our life for reflecting on those things, which involves not only reflecting on, in general, those principles and those things, but reflecting on the Word of God, which has all of those things, we are going to, I believe, end up having less anxiety and having peace and having understanding that comes as a result of that in the context, and not be as overwhelmed. We're making time for those things that are good. Doing what is good is the next step, and learning to follow on that practice. Paul talks about it in the next verse. He says, the things that you have learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do, and the God of peace will be with you. We're not just meditating on these things so that the end result is that we feel good about the things that we're meditating on. That is certainly a part of it. We also want to put it into practice. Paul uses the example of his own life, not because Paul is bragging. In other parts, he does encourage others to follow his example, in as much as he follows the Lord. And Paul was a very good example of what the Christian life looks like. So he could be a good example to the Philippians. We may know people in our life that are good examples of the Christian life, and we can learn from them and their practice. If we jump back to 2 Peter, and we go back to the first chapter, in the third verse, Peter says that his divine power has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us by virtue, by which having been given to us exceedingly great and precious promises, that through these you may be partakers of the divine nature. We have the knowledge. We have the equipment that we have to do it. We have to actively go ahead and put that into practice to get the benefit of that knowledge in our life. Christianity is often called a personal faith. And that can be misapplied sometimes, where people will say, I have a customized or unique relationship with God that nobody else has. And my walk is completely different than your walk. There's an extent to which that is true, where our life and our backgrounds and other things, we do need to take that into consideration when we're applying the principles. so that we can do the things that are pleasing to the Lord that follow in verse 5 through to 11 of that same text. But here's the point that ultimately I think I'm trying to make from this text, from Philippians 4 verse 8. And you've heard me talk about it and have entire lessons on it before in other sermons or in Bible studies. What we have a limited amount of time available to us. What are we going to spend that time focused on when we can help what we can do with that time? If we focus on the negative and we allow that negative to be bombarding us all the time, I think we are going to be tormented and overwhelmed. If we're focusing on the positive, we will reduce the amount of anxiety that we have, and we will have peace, and we will be better equipped and learn to help and to serve others. The biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges, not the biggest, but one of the biggest challenges I think facing Christians in our modern world is distraction and focus. The devil's tried numerous tactics. He is, Shelley and I both like Star Trek and the Borg in the Star Trek. They adapt very quickly to whatever tactic is used to defeat them. And I think in some regards, the devil is like that, where he tries a trick and it doesn't work and he quickly adapts and he tries something else. He tried persecution in the first century. He persecuted numerous Christians. He just made the situation worse because then they went everywhere spreading the gospel. Well, that didn't exactly work. We see numerous tactics. The latest one, especially for countries like Canada, the States, Britain, is, the so-called first world or developed countries. I think the tactic is to keep us constantly distracted. It's like walking through a carnival where you've got, if you had to walk through a carnival ground and you're trying to get to the other side, and there's all these lights flashing from the rides, and there's all these people telling you to play these games, and there's all these, these little fun houses that you can go to. The bright lights, the distraction, that's what a lot of these things are. That's distracting with positive. I think we can get distracted with negative as well. And we need to really buckle down on where our focus is. So, really, we could have just as easily gone to, and I think we'll conclude with this verse, Colossians chapter 1 and verse 2. It says, I like the since if here is there's no doubt that the Colossians were raised with Christ. So, since you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on the things of the earth. Lot was tormented because he saw all the worldliness around him. We can be tormented when we see all the worldliness around us and choose to focus on that too much and get distracted by it. We can look and reflect on those things. There's some things that aren't avoidable. I mean, you're going to see and hear a certain amount. You can't just remove yourself from the world. Inasmuch as we have the time and an effort that we can control what we are, we can spend the time to focus on the things that are above, which won't make us shake our heads, won't put us in a bad mood, won't discourage us and get us down, but instead will motivate us to do more good and to share our faith with others. So I encourage you to do the same, really meditate on these things, as Paul would say in Philippians 4 verse 8. And if anyone requires any the help of the church, the assistance with your faith or with your struggles, or needs to obey the gospel, let us know that as we stand and sing.